All right, let's jump into it. Harvey Wiley and how the FDA got started.
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting story. I know we've discussed a couple other topics that are like kind of similar to this, but this is really the guy who got it started from even the earliest renditions of the FDA, which were actually a part of the not Food and Drug Administration, but the agricultural regulatory body of the time. So I guess we can start with who he was, what his background was.
Yeah. How the time period of when it started.
Yeah, you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, so this is pre-1900s. Harvey Wiley was born in 1844, American physicist, physician, and early advocate for food safety, known as the father of Pure Food and Drug Act. You were saying earlier, kind of like a pivotal person in...
Yeah, he was a pretty big and well-known, respected chemist and scientist of that time, actually. And it's not to say that there weren't many others that were also involved in this process, but
he was really good at getting the word out and trying to do something about it.
Yeah, and he was well respected. So he really got his kind of foundational start. He was studying. He was born in Indiana, so a lot of his early works were when he was at Purdue. But even before then, he had actually done his grad school and medical school kind of training at Harvard. So I mean, we're talking about a guy who was pretty intelligent. Even back then, Harvard was a kind of symbol of that,
right,
being on the up and up. And so he went and started his own lab in around the 1870s. Did a lot of different work, but he was predominantly looking at food additives, everything from sugars, understanding the different sugars that were both synthetic and naturally occurring. But also he got really into looking at preservatives, additives that were put into foods of the time. He started actually looking at dyes. Dye chemistry was something he was very interested in.
The dyes that are kind of using cereals now. You hear about the Fruit Loops and Lucky Charms, the Yellow 40 or the Mountain Dew.
Yeah, it's actually kind of, as we were just talking about this, it's kind of, I don't know if it's interesting or disturbing or a combination of both. But in reality, a lot of the dyes that are still used in commercial items, and even later on when we talk about the experiments, particularly related to the Poison Squad experiments, even some of those ingredients that he tested, they're still found in modern day products, albeit at different concentrations, maybe with slightly different purposes.
Yeah.
But yeah, some of these dyes are kind of the early versions or contemporaries of ones that are currently in the kind of mainstream media. This class of azo dyes is actually something I take particular interest in because I've worked with them in my graduate work, but they're the ones that are kind of looking at being controversial in the current era. So this isn't something new that we're seeing, with conversations related to even incoming people to the administration. RFK has been a huge proponent of looking at this, but he, being Wiley in this case, has actually been looking at these kinds of things for over 150 years. And so not just these class of azo dyes, the ones that he looked at particularly were called Sudan red, another one called methyl yellow, which is somewhat related to the modern contemporaries I mentioned, tartrazine or yellow dye 5, and like you said, red dye 40. He looked at other ones that were metallic in nature, so aniline-derived dyes that were binding heavy metals, things like arsenic, things like lead. These were being used.
When you say binding heavy metals, they bound heavy metals in the body or just naturally?
No, like that was actually part of the synthetic dye. They're basically
Aniline's
ligands
bound to heavy metals.
Aniline ligands binding these heavy metals. And to be fair, this also was common practice back then. They used arsenic dyes in everything from candy, no joke, candy, feed it to your child, to wallpaper.
Yeah.
And if I'm not mistaken, it's because it gave this kind of almost turquoise, this very beautiful turquoise kind of bluish color, bluish green color that was very catchy and kind of cool. Little did they know they were actually poisoning themselves as well as their children, and in many cases this was to a tragic consequence. But that is kind of the notion of what got Wiley interested. Is this is a time when people, aside from just dying from any number of diseases.
Yeah, maybe we should set the stage of what the food regulation and adding chalk to food.
Yeah.
No regulations on sterilization, refrigeration.
Right. So yeah, this was a really critical time because, we have the Industrial Revolution going on, kind of the modernization of America in many ways. But like you alluded to, there still wasn't many of the common practices that we would deem now as like
take for granted.
Yeah, we take for granted as why wouldn't they employ this? Those weren't really even known at the time.
Right. Yeah, it's not even thought of.
And we're talking about things like refrigeration was kind of coming of age at that time. People knew the basics, that you could get sick having eaten food that had been like left out. So refrigeration was becoming a more typical thing, but in many parts of the country, we're talking rural areas, and even in the city, if you're talking about a population that was vastly below the poverty line in most cases, you didn't have access to that kind of thing until probably a little bit later.
They were making a couple dollars a day in today's money.
So it wasn't something that you had access to by and large till probably a little bit later in the teens or 20s, past the turn of the century, so to speak. But yeah, there was a lot of issues. Food adulteration, things as simple as, the basic premise of the diet for most people, most Americans at that time, was meat, starches like potatoes,
meat and potatoes,
quite literally, and milk, and dairy products. Those were the three most accessible things. But they were also, aside from the potatoes, not so much, but the other two, dairy and meats, were two of the most targeted food groups when it comes to adulteration, use of really bad contaminants to preserve things, things that were quite toxic, being put in these foods being shipped and sold, and people ultimately getting very sick. So dairy was a big one.
Right. That kind of ties back. So there's a lot of the stuff that they put into it was in hopes of, or they actually did preserve it longer. Mm-hmm. And so like a lot of the processed foods that we're dealing with now that there's been pushback against.
Similar idea.
They're processed because they have a longer shelf life.
Longer shelf life, that means you can sell more of your product. You take less economic hit, by having to throw away items. You still get, essentially, you get paid for it even after it's expired. Now, the whole reason why we can go now to the grocery store and with some reasonable amount of confidence buy off the shelf is because of things that happened during this era that weren't that way. Now, I will put a asterisk there. For whatever reason, maybe it's just an awareness, but I swear we've seen an almost increase in the last year at least, or a couple years, of like foodborne illness outbreaks.
Well, like E. coli and
E. coli, listeria were huge this year. Things that have happened for quite some time. Definitely not to the degree that we're talking about at this era, but even in modern times, we still have these challenges.
Yeah.
But think of that only 10 to probably 100 times worse, right? Because no one is looking. No one is holding anyone accountable. Dairy products, particularly milk, were being delivered to doorsteps at a massive scale, and a lot of times it was the case that would get people really sick. And the reason for that is people that were selling these products, let's say your milk went bad, it would begin to change color. They wanted to continue to sell that milk past its supposed expiration date. They would put anything from these dyes that Wiley was interested in to chalk and plaster to keep it white so that people weren't suspected. In other cases, there was examples where people wanted that cream look on the top of your milk, and they wouldn't have it because they were actually diluting it with water and other things to stretch their product further.
Yeah.
And so to
cutting the product.
Basically cutting the product, and to circumvent that and make it look more realistic, they would take things like cow and pig brain, froth it up into, you know, this milky, creamy looking stuff and dump it on top just to get the look. And people would die from this, right? People would get extraordinarily sick. There's statistics I was reading about around the turn of the century, so 1900s. In New York City, there was outbreaks where, like, children under the age of 10, like a third to 50% of them either got sick or were killed by these kinds of, like, manipulations with dairy products. That's almost, like, inconceivable, right? I almost saw those stats and were like, that can't be legitimate. But I found it in multiple places. Now, I'm not a historical expert, but like that sounds pretty ridiculous, and I think that's why this got so much attention around that time. But in any case, so yeah, Wiley was looking at dyes. He was looking at several different things. One thing became abundantly clear to him, though, is that this really needed to be looked at. Whether it was dairy or meat had its own bunch of issues. A lot of that actually didn't come to light till a little bit later when he was already doing experimentation. But those were the two big things that were really problematic at that time. Ultimately, he did get hired by the federal government to start looking at these things in a little bit more detail. So in 1883, he was appointed as the Chief Chemist, as I mentioned, of the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, which is still ongoing. But this was really the only kind of, you know, bureaucratic agency at that time that was really even concerned with public health or keeping people safe.
Health and Human Services not around?
I don't know, but I don't think it played a huge role. You know, you might want to fact check that one. In any case, he oversaw the Bureau of Chemistry, which is essentially a subcomponent of the Department of Agriculture, and ultimately kind of the precursor of the FDA. His role was kind of to look at these food and safety issues, which became kind of growing with the industrialization of America at that time.
Yeah, Health and Human Services didn't come around till the 50s.
Yeah, that's kind of crazy,
it's
right?
Like almost 100 years after Department of Agriculture.
And not to kind of destroy the ending here, but even the FDA in its modern form wasn't formed till like 1938.
Yeah.
Various renditions led up to what we'll talk about. But so, I mean, we're talking about a governing body that has existed for less than 100 years. And I mean, again, we take it for granted. Even today, there's like discussions of, you know, the FDA, maybe critiques even of the FDA.
Yeah.
But in reality, it would be so much worse if we didn't at least have that body in place.
Well, yeah, just keeping some. It would be nice if you can keep all the regulations that people will still follow it. But I don't. The thing about people in general is they're always looking to cut corners, and there's always wily people. Not this Wiley, but the other Wiley Coyote type people.
Right. Yeah. There's always those people trying to kind of stay ahead of the game by cutting corners, right? And not to get too far off topic as we transition to talking actually about his experiments in the Poison Squad, but I mean, we talked a little bit about dairy, the meat industry, as was seen a little bit later. Upton Sinclair actually wrote. He was a kind of journalist of the time. He wrote a book and was actually kind of a collaborator of Wiley to some degree about the meat industry, the meat packing industry of that time.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of this.
Yeah, it's called The Jungle. And this was another kind of blow to these people that were kind of wrong, well, no doubt, wrongfully selling to people.
Yeah.
These are factories They had really terrible sanitation records, slaughterhouses, really terrible sanitation environments, and not just for the consumer, but also the workers.
Yeah.
But I mean, like if you've ever read excerpts from that, which I remember we had to when I was in like high school, we're talking about like rats basically being ground up into sausage along with meat products that were old and rotting on the shelf that were thrown back in and combined with fresher meat as to like hide the putrid taste and things like that. Really atrocious and disgusting stuff, and people were just selling this like guilt-free.
One of the good things about, I guess, regulations, people are kind of down on regulations because they say it slows things around, but without the regulations, this process wouldn't have gotten any better, because if you're in a competition and somebody's undercutting because they don't have to, because they can sell more meat and it's lesser quality. The only way
to compete then is to do the same thing and maybe even do it worse.
Right. So they have to level the playing field of, hey, this is the sanitation standards. Everybody has to, and then you raise the bar for everybody.
Right. No, I mean, it is kind of that almost double-edged sword, or the coin flip, like which is worse. But you do see this in other parts of the world right now, and by and large, there's some arguments over like European Union governing bodies versus FDA, who's more effective, things like that, and not getting too far down that rabbit hole, but we're still a lot better off living in this country under the current regulations than we would be without them, or in other places, most other places. And even just going back and looking at this history, it's really like mind-blowing, just how bad it was. Ultimately, after a little over a decade and a half, this idea that foods were being contaminated, or even, as we said, like manipulated deliberately to deceive people, was pretty abundantly clear to Wiley. And he saw this as a huge problem. And he was like, we need to do something about this, but people aren't really listening. They weren't listening in the government. This is around the time that Theodore Roosevelt was coming into office, who actually would become a critical person, lend an ear to this issue.
Well, this is during like the Great Depression. Well, at least some of this was during the Great Depression and
the later parts, but this was well before that. But there just wasn't really, like you said, a lot of regulation at that time. People weren't as interested in it, and as kind of the leader of this movement, he thought kind of one of the few ways I could really instill this idea as being important is to basically, without a doubt, show experimentation that shows that these ingredients that are used in common products are dangerous. He had to actually do experimentation, and unfortunately for him, it couldn't be something that was non-compelling. So he chose to design what would later be dubbed as the Poison Squad experiments, to kind of assert this idea. The idea was that he was going to have a group of volunteers, young men. They're all kind of working for the government at that time, some organization or another. He recruited at least 12 men, 12 that became kind of the staples to these experiments. And I believe this all came to fruition and started around 1902. But the idea was that they were going to be testing some of these ingredients that were openly being used to preserve food, because he suspected that many of them had some pretty gnarly effects and could reasonably be the reason why so many people he had seen in his life and so many people were getting sick in that time. So with that in mind, he didn't really have a lot of trouble getting too many volunteers, which I think is kind of crazy. Like, they were pretty open and honest about it.
Well, maybe they saw that this was a problem too, or maybe they just wanted to do something new and fun and interesting.
Well, I think if you think about the era, right? These are young men, for the most part, young, healthy men. Still, most of the country, even if you were working for the government at the time, you're not making a lot of money, right? And that was part of the deal. is that if you were to be a part of these experiments, you got essentially 3 meals a day for free, albeit they were poisoned.
Potentially poisoned.
Potentially poisoned. And I think, at least in some places, they weren't paid, but in some places I read that they were actually given room and board. So there was a little bit of incentive, and if that was something that was really tough to come by in that era, seems like a small price to pay, even almost too good to be true. Like, how bad could it be, right? Turns out it could be pretty bad. They just didn't know it. But so they recruited their folks. 1902. This is performed by the Bureau of Chemistry in laboratories in Washington, D.C. Wiley and several other scientists basically were going to go down this list of different ingredients, spike these ingredients into meals. And to be fair, they were like, we're going to make these very nutritious and appetizing meals, but it's going to have these different poisons.
Did they tell them what is going to be in it? Or
I
potentially?
I don't know if they were fully aware of the exact ingredient at any given time. But they were warned that, these could have pretty negative consequences. And a lot of these guys, I think, took it upon themselves almost as like a badge of honor. Like, I'm too tough for this to hurt me, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that makes sense.
There was guys that felt pretty confident that, this isn't going to be a big deal.
Yeah, because one of the stipulations was that they had to be super healthy.
Yeah, not only super healthy, but the idea behind that was that, if you have a general population, right, you're going to have people that are really healthy, you're going to have people that are not so healthy, people that are vulnerable, young people, children, babies, right?
Old.
And older people, and people who are ailing from any variety of diseases at that time. So the idea was that if these toxins actually affected these very young, very healthy men to a degree that they could die or at least be hospitalized or sickened quite badly, then, just think of how bad it could be for these other populations. So if even the kind of most healthy are affected, then this is kind of adding to the being more compelling that this is a problem. So they had very controlled diets. They were actually told, like, you can leave this area, right? We're rooming and boarding you, but by all means, go do your jobs, come back. You have to eat all your meals here, right? That's kind of the control of this experiment, right? You can't be sneaking food on the side. That's one of the huge stipulations, because we need to know that any negative consequences came from what we fed you.
Right.
And I believe that they kind of did it gradually in most cases. They didn't really know what concentration to begin, right? They're kind of guessing, but they want to err on the side of caution of it.
But they knew that these were being used, but they didn't know how much.
Right, and they didn't know at what level does it become consequential to where you see ingredients. Is this something that's going to happen right away, or is this going to happen over the course of weeks? They're prepared to do this for a number of weeks for each given ingredient, slowly kind of ramping up the relative amounts, kind of looking to see, okay, and if you do it in slow, increasing increments, at least you can say, like, okay, it seems fairly safe up until this level. And then, once people start showing signs of sickness, they'd be like, okay, that's kind of our modern way of looking at this is like LD50 or something like that, in controlled trials.
Yeah.
They didn't really have that kind of thought process at that time or capability at the time. But that was kind of the thought behind it, is like, we'll ramp it up. We'll see how bad it gets.
It's kind of good that maybe some of the participants thought that this wasn't going to help. It wasn't going to hurt them, so the placebo effect doesn't really come into play.
Right.
Because you could think, like, sometimes when I eat something that's a little bit maybe iffy, sometimes I feel like, oh, did my stomach hurt? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I feel that. Interesting enough, there's like anecdotes where I think one of the first things they test was called boric acid, otherwise known as borax.
Used to clean toilets.
Yeah, it's a cleaning product. It's a preservative. It's used for a lot of different things, actually. Even now, right? I've used it as something it's a little more obscure in terms of usage, but to like cure my salmon eggs to go fishing. Like, it's gnarly stuff. Like, you wouldn't want to ingest that, but that was a very common preservative of the time. People were putting this in their meats to keep it shelf stable. But there's an anecdote. They use this, to, as an ingredient, they added it into the food. And in the first couple meals that these guys were eating, whether they knew it was contaminated or not, like which food item was contaminated or not, it became clear that by the experimenters that they're like, oh, they're not eating this food. And it just so happened to be the food that they dosed. And they're like, well, why aren't you eating it? And one of the challenges of this experiment was like, well, it tastes funny. It tastes weird. As you could imagine, if you put enough borax into something, it's going to be kind of hard to hide. It's going to take on probably a pretty uncomfortable taste. And so that was one of the complications. They had to do it at doses that, were going to probably elicit a response, but that they could conceal in some way and not make it like intolerable to eat, or else you're going to not get the data you need. That was one of the big challenges. And of course, like, ethical considerations, right? You're potentially could kill these guys. Like, they made it clear that that was a possibility. No one really, I think, maybe took it that seriously. I think there was a kind of this gusto or courage, maybe unfounded courage that a lot of these guys had. But I mean, for all intents and purposes, they didn't really know, the experimenters for sure, that wasn't going to happen. But yeah, so they start with boric acid. Really didn't take that long for them to realize, okay, this is a problem. I want to say it was a matter of days where people started to get sick. For most cases, when they would be ingesting these poisons, I mean, first and foremost, you're going to have stomach issues, right? As with most bad food, right? They would have severe nausea, severe diarrhea, in more severe cases, pretty bad vomiting, to the point where people had to be removed from that trial. I want to say there's even reports of people having kind of internal stomach bleeding. Not really sure how they figured that out, but I can only imagine.
Might throw up.
Probably, yeah. Severe fatigue, dizziness, stuff like that. Pretty, I wouldn't say it was non-life-threatening, but pretty severe, relatively non-life-threatening problems, but severe enough where people, couldn't continue to do it. And so it became quite clear in most of these situations that what they were dealing with was problematic, was dangerous. Here's just a list of some of the ones that they did test. So we already talked about borax. Another one, salicylic acid. This is an interesting one because I think you and I talked about this. Salicylic acid actually is one of the, I guess, not derivatives, but precursors of things like aspirin.
It's the main ingredient in aspirin.
Yeah, it's aspirin has, I think, one extra methyl group on it that wouldn't ordinarily be there, but it's a traditional medicine for pain that has been used for many hundreds, if not thousands of years by indigenous people. I think it comes from a bark. But it's also now used in a lot of products, particularly those, and its anti-inflammatory properties make it good for pain. I think it's used in cosmetics for a variety of reasons.
Oh, okay. Aspirin is acetyl salicylic.
Yeah, so it has that methyl group.
Yeah, carbonyl methyl. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's used even still in a lot of cosmetic and drug-related products. The primary difference is at that time, they were using it as a preservative. They were using it at quite high concentrations as a preservative. And even now, in the modern sense, if you use too high of concentration or use it all the time for your skin, you have problems. I know a lot of people, like, if you take too much aspirin, there's times where people have done that, it can cause a lot of internal problems, including bleeding, vomiting, really, really dangerous if you take it in too high quantities. So it's not surprising that even though we do still use it in some capacity, the amount matters, right? And probably, again, not as a surprise, but they found that, there are quantities that weren't that high.
Yeah, aspirin, because I remember when my wife was pregnant, there was one that between aspirin and ibuprofen, I always mixed the two together, but I think looking into it, I think aspirin is the one that is worse for pregnant.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I know I have a family member too that I think is like, I'm not sure which class it is, but there's like the NSAIDs and there's the non-NSAIDs, and some people are like really allergic to those. I don't know if that plays a role into the dangers that they saw, but in some cases people can like die from essentially allergic reaction.
Tylenol is considered the safest.
Interesting.
Tylenol.
Yeah, so I mean, just like with borax, they were seeing very similar repercussions. Severe nausea, internal bleeding, diarrhea, fatigue, dizziness. Not pleasant things. Continuing down this list, we won't go through all of them. Formaldehyde was another one that is just kind of mind-blowing, right? Because, I mean,
not just because we know of it today.
Yeah,
but like then,
we now know today just like how gnarly it is. But, in all of these things, like, they do exactly what they were using it for. But that's not really the point, right? I mean, formaldehyde is a great preservative. It literally forms, like, covalent bonds and holds things together. But we also now know that it is, like, we employ it for preservative.
Right. They were using it for embalming.
Yeah.
In that time period.
So they were already aware that it was used for like embalming, and they were just like,
well, they knew, it's good for dead people. It's probably good for this dead meat. I'm trying to sell it.
I guess. But, yeah.
The street corner.
It's pretty rough. I mean, like, we now know just how bad it is, not just at like the large levels, but even at small levels, what it can do internally and really mess things up by cross-linking and stuff. So no wonder that was making people extraordinarily ill. Another one, copper sulfate. I don't know as much about copper sulfate and its contemporary uses, or its like mechanisms of action. Benzoic acid, sulfuric acid, that one maybe a little more intuitive. Yeah, sulfuric acid ingestion would be bad. That kind of...
Copper sulfate is used in fungicides, algicides, electroplating, chemical manufacturing, some water treatment for algae.
Right.
And some antiseptic and fungal treatment for
So
animals.
I mean, like, I think if you look up any one of these, they're going to be like antibacterial, antifungal.
Yeah.
Because that's what they're using them for. But I mean, anything can be have those like properties. That doesn't necessarily translate to being super great for us either, though, because we're biological entities as well.
Right. They probably just saw that, hey, this works to kill bacteria. Let's just throw it in here and it'll kill the bacteria. They didn't
go like, oh, but it might also kill us,
Yeah.
So, yeah. I can't say that they didn't at least have good intuition towards those things, but they maybe didn't think it all the way through. I want to say, and I guess I should look this up. I'm not sure exactly how long each of these trials went for, but I mean, this work was done over the course of multiple years. I want to say like about 2 or so years. I don't know that everyone involved remained the same either the whole time. But I do know that while people did get sick from these things, which did prove the point that Wiley was trying to make, no one actually died. Now, I couldn't find any data on this, like what happened to these people after the experiments ended.
They get some weird rare form of cancer.
I mean, I can only imagine, but like, yeah, there probably was some like downstream effects of this in their lives, but it was pretty. I don't know that they actually kept good tabs on these folks after the fact, and I couldn't find anything.
Yeah, well, do you remember the name of the book you read that was on this?
Yeah, actually, I looked it up, and it's been many years since it came out in 2018.
Oh, well.
So not that long ago, but long enough where some of the details are a little bit hazy to me. I had it pulled up here. It's called The Poison Squad, One Chemist's Single-Minded Crusade for Food Safety at the Turn of the 20th Century, and it's written by Deborah Blum, or Bloom, B-L-U-M. But essentially, it does look at kind of Wiley's life. It's through the lens of Wiley's life, and kind of the precursor leading up. It does go into detail into the experiments, and kind of the aftermath as well, which we haven't quite got to, but there's a lot of politics and kind of history involved here, because ultimately the idea was like, we do these experiments, people will take notice, and then maybe regulations can go into play. That was a strategy. Unfortunately, that did happen, right? The experiments themselves ultimately got public attention. I think you even noted that you saw that people were reading about it in newspapers. And it was kind of like, I wouldn't equate them to celebrities, but it was like interesting and fascinating enough where people would follow the story.
Yeah.
They were kind of like pseudo celebrities of the time. These 12 men doing this was kind of interesting and intriguing. And people did take notice, including important people in the government, particularly, as I mentioned, people like Theodore Roosevelt, president of the time, did end up recognizing that this is an issue that needed to be addressed. And he's an interesting historical figure unto himself, but I guess as part of his legacy, he actually was one of the first, presidents to put into act certain passages of law that protected the consumer. One of the culminating and first kind of laws of that type was the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, which, I think Wiley actually garnered a nickname. I'm trying to remember what it was. I believe they called it, while that was like the technical name, they later referred to it as like the Wiley Act, in honor of him. But so that was a huge kind of step in the right direction. You actually had someone take notice. You had government beginning to actually use legislation to protect consumers. This was not the first not the last time that this would happen.
Was it the Crusader of Pure Food?
That might have been it. They would call it like the Pure Food Movement. So essentially, he had lobbied Congress, as well as other people in the government for this, arguing that the government needed to protect consumers based on his results. He showed quite literally that it could hurt people.
Prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs, and adulterated means the addition of harmful substances.
Right.
Laid the groundwork for the establishment of federal standards for food and drug safety. Yeah,
and so that I think was for his goal, that was a huge victory. Kind of as you and I discussed, this isn't the only thing going on during that time that related to consumer health. You and I have had this conversation before, but there was a lot of other stuff going on that ultimately would lead to further legislation. Particularly, we talked about some of the the quack medicines that were popular during that same
like the
time.
radium.
Yeah, like the Radithor and radium drinks, radium tonics, and any number of stuff like that. Even like Coke was an interesting.
Oh yeah, Coca-Cola.
Wiley actually took exception to the use of caffeine in beverages and things like that. He wasn't even maybe as concerned. Just the cocaine part. Yeah, probably not great, but he was like, caffeine itself to children is a bad thing, which I remember hearing that like as a kid within our lifetimes, like that's still an issue. Like, should you allow children
to
have caffeine
like sodas
and
and everything? Yeah, there's a lot of, if you drink enough of them, there's quite a bit.
Right. And I'm like, it's kind of crazy that this guy like 100 years prior was already kind of advocating against some of the same things that even modern advocates have been looking at, within our lifetime. So, so along with that, you eventually, a little bit further down the road, so while the Pure Food and Drug Act was a landmark piece of legislation, it still didn't really specify or establish an agency that was purely dedicated to enforcing it. So that is kind of where it's like, oh, look at me, we put this law into act, right? But a law doesn't really do all that much if it's not being enforced.
Right.
And so that's why I think there was still such a heavy prevalence of issues that kind of, despite the legislation, persisted for so long. That's why even, problems that we talked about, the meat problem, the dairy problem, these other quackery type tonics and medicines, that didn't stop. I mean, Upton Sinclair, if I'm not mistaken, he ultimately released The Jungle in the late 19-teens, like 1918. I mean, that's 12 years after this act. And so even though they're aware of these issues, no enforcement. And people were still facing this all the time. So the responsibility was still technically under the Bureau of Chemistry, that department that Wiley was heading. But unfortunately for the USDA and the Bureau, Wiley ended up resigning in 1912. He did so because he was having kind of political battles with industry interests, as it was referred to.
The Jungle was published in 1906. You had it in your notes.
1906.
Yeah. All
right, so maybe I'm thinking about something else. Okay, it was around the same time, but nonetheless, things kept, being an issue. But yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, he ended up resigning from the USDA.
Yeah, he ended up resigning, and so kind of the spearhead, the name that really took this project by storm, is gone. And there really, to my knowledge, wasn't like someone to really take that and run with it quite so heavily. And even the reason why he resigned, right? These kind of political battles, these disputes with the industry and probably other people, associated with politics. It just kind of reminds me of kind of the arguments we're facing now too.
Yeah. Is
like, how we're worried about kind of this corruption, this intermingling of corporation and federal agency. The very agencies that are supposed to protect us are also being, potentially bought out or heavily influenced by big money.
Yeah. By
these corporations, corporate interests. And so I think anytime we look at something historically, it is important to recognize like maybe things are better, but oftentimes, as the old cliche and adage goes, history does tend to repeat itself. How far have we actually progressed?
Right.
Human are still human, and our interests are still probably fairly similar.
Yeah.
So,
well, especially with the profit model driving things, unless there's specific rules and enforcement of those rules, the profit model is going to reign king. So if you can squeeze more profit and a couple people get sick, there's going to be people that do that.
Yeah, and I firmly believe to some level that hasn't changed.
No.
And as sad as it is, a lot of times, even modern corporations, even modern pharmaceutical companies, or whatever you want to call it, food packagers and distributors, they know that that's part of it, and they're willing to kind of risk it to make that money. And it's the losses associated with having like an issue are built into the money making scheme,
the pricing model.
Yeah. And that's, I think, like, again, I'm not like a economic guru. I don't know all the ins and out of it, but ethically that's still very problematic. And I think Wiley, in his core, was a man of kind of high moral and ethical standards, and that's what bothered him, is that he saw progress, but he continued to see corruption, and ultimately he didn't want to continue to be a part of it. I think he just kind of got tired. It's not that he stopped, but he couldn't like put himself in that environment. He figured he had to do it a different way. And so he would continue to advocate. I think later on he actually even participated with other kind of advocacy groups. I think there was one, it was like a women's group. I'm not sure of the specifics of that, but they were...
Yeah, and here he was at Good Housekeeping magazine, which is still a thing around today. That's kind of popular. Maybe declining a little bit, but I remember seeing that growing up.
Like, right. I think he was like writing essentially like op-eds, like to raise awareness and stuff like that. So it's not that he completely disappeared, but he did resign. And so for a little while, that was 1912, you kind of have this persistence of issues, right? It wasn't till a little bit later, I want to say it was the late 20s, in 1927, there was a creation of the Food, Drug, and Insecticide Administration, which was, again, a subdivision of the USDA overseeing food and drug safety. So that's progress, I would say. In 1930, this division was reorganized and renamed Food and Drug Administration. So that is actually kind of the technical precursor of the FDA. And there continued to be legislation that got put in place. I think you and I have discussed this again in relation to like the other topics we've covered. I think there's like the Food and Cosmetics Act of 1938. I don't have that here.
Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act.
That was, something that came a little bit later, addressing kind of the radium issue, like coming from like Radium Girls and our old friend Eben Bayer. But so, I mean, the real creation started in 1930, but obviously there was a lot more to come, and there still is. I mean, even
right, but this is the first real impactful study that led to it. Yeah,
these were the major pillars that really set the foundation for that, so to speak. So pretty big deal. Obviously, the FDA continues to play a critical role, while its power, I guess, and kind of oversight has grown tremendously. And you and I are quite familiar with that, based on our work. And I think a lot of people don't have a good understanding. Maybe even I don't have the best understanding of it. But it's, for all the critiques that you hear about in media or, modern culture, I think that generally speaking, it's better that they're doing what they're doing with such completeness and thoroughness than the alternative.
Right. Doesn't mean that there's not room for improvement, though.
Yeah, there's always going to be room for improvement. But I think, like, I've talked with people, like, why, for example, why does a drug take so long to get to market? And I don't have all the answers to that. I think that's also a case-by-case thing.
Yeah.
But like after having come into a field or even a sector that directly works with the FDA, it's become a little bit more clear because they are very thorough.
Yeah.
And it takes years to compile data that is compelling enough to them
Right.
to...
And some of these studies, the whole outline of it is for months on end, up to a year or even longer. And so you can't really
just for
speed
the
that
most
up.
basic studies, and that's before clinical studies, which could be another couple years. And then there's, post-clinical evaluations and room to improve there. And so, people are like, why does it take 10 years for a new cancer drug, say, to go on the market? Well, it's because that's how long it takes to
Right.
do pre-studies, clinical studies, post-studies, go through all the kind of bureaucratic submissions and things like that.
Right. There are some things that the FDA has implemented that help streamline that, especially with like cancer things.
Yeah.
If it...
Well, and there are examples of that even outside of like cancer, right? There's been times where, even if we look at examples of COVID, there's certain times where they've cut requirements or cut corners, so to speak, to allow for emergency use of things. I think there has to be a little bit of adaptability within those kinds of organizations, but we could go down that rabbit hole a lot further. But it is just to say that I think we live a pretty privileged life in the United States compared to some other places because of Wiley's
Right.
considerations, his experiments, and kind of the legacy is that by and large we're probably better off
for sure.
than most places. Is there any other kinds of topics that we wanted to rehash or talk about?
Not really. Not that I can think of. I think we did a pretty good job on what the poison squad actually was, what they were given, some of the effects of it, and how that kind of led to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act.
Yeah, I think I learned a lot reading about this. Thank you, ChatGPT. Shout out. But I think that it would be kind of interesting to for people who are interested in all the different ways that food was manipulated or adulterated at that time.
Right. I mean, it's still today, it's still technically adulterated, depending on, it's not the toxicity levels, but there's still added dyes, there's still added preservatives.
For sure.
I think that's the whole thing with RFK is, what are these things actually doing to us?
Yeah, and I think to speak to that, right, there is I think, a very valid point there. There is kind of this list of chemicals, as he often brings up. And I've read some of his work and I've listened to some of his speaking points. There's 10,000 different chemicals that are more or less what we call approved by the FDA.
Allowed here.
Yeah. That aren't in other places.
Right.
And one of the issues, and I think it's a legitimate concern, is that 10,000. First of all, that's an enormous amount of chemicals. It would take armies of scientists and decades of time to vet every single chemical and make sure. I mean, this example of the poison squad, right? You don't have to do maybe that exact process, but he looked at maybe half a dozen or more.
Yeah.
We're talking 10,000. That's a lot of resources, a lot of time.
But it's also, where's the cutoff of harm? Because it's if it doesn't cause, if it just causes...
I don't know. I mean, the problem is that...
Because I don't think any of these really cause the nausea, puking and...
It's not so much the acute effects that I think most people...
Right, it's the long term.
It's the long term that we just don't know, and that's disturbing, right? And a lot of these they're called generally considered safe.
Yeah, generally considered safe.
It means that they haven't actually been tested. They haven't been vetted. They are using kind of the idea that, well, they've been in products for years or decades, and there's no evidence that this is harmful.
They cause harm, yeah.
But that's really hard to even say that with a straight face. I mean, that's kind of like saying...
Not tested, yeah.
It's like saying, oh, well, no one's died directly from that, but how can you say that with certainty? Like, what's your level of certainty? It's like, no, that guy died of cancer. Okay. Well, could that have cancer been related to any one of these 10,000 chemicals, or maybe even a combination of... You really can't say that without certainty. And so, I don't know, it does raise a valid question of, like, is that acceptable?
Right. Yeah, the difficulty in testing those, because you eat one ho-ho, you're going to have 40 different chemicals or whatever it is. Mm-hmm. And that's not the only thing you're eating that day. So it's how do you know?
The variables are so many that how can you narrow it down?
Yeah.
But at the same time, I guess you could take really one of two extremes. You could say, all right, let's keep doing... I feel like what we're doing is kind of an extreme on one end. It's like basically like, well, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah. But I think that actually isn't a great assessment. I think there's plenty of things broke worth fixing, and people are trying to speak up about that. When people do speak up, the problem is people are like, oh, you're a conspiracy theorist, or they're labeling RFK as this like evil man promoting junk science, when in fact that's not true. Yeah. There's a lot of science to back up some of his claims or concerns.
There's just common sense too in certain things.
Well, and it's like, what's the downside of trying to be a little more careful?
Right.
Are you really willing to risk the health of millions of people?
Yeah, what's the downside of becoming healthier?
Yeah, of at least investigating. I mean, worst case scenario, you do some investigations and you're like, okay, it's not as bad as we were worried about.
Right.
Great. Then at least you can move forward with kind of that clear conscience.
Right. You get a long way with $1 billion, and that's a very small portion of what we're spending on our government budget.
I think the other extreme is, okay, eliminate everything, right, and only allow the things that have been vetted.
That's going to be crazy.
Which would be crazy. It's going to completely... change the dynamic of how food is processed, and maybe eliminate, like...
I think overall that would probably be the most beneficial, but getting that passed...
Is it realistic?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of reasons, like you said, that people wouldn't probably be okay with that. Namely, corporations, man. They're going to lose a lot of money. They're going to lobby against that kind of extreme...
Right, put them out of business.
And so, is there an in-between? Most certainly. But what does that look like? And can we get to a point where we actually see, true benefit occurring?
Right. They could do like here's the list of 100 that we're going to do that are going to be banned in the next 5 years unless there's safety trials. And then just the next 100. And so over time, you're not going to be able to do it in a year or two, but at least... for our kids and kids' kids,
it's going to be a generational thing.
Yeah,
I think at very least,
and if they're kill the corporations at least.
Right. I think at very least there are like I said, there's plenty of literature. I think the problem, as you and I have discussed in literature, is that you can often find literature that supports a claim and technically scientific literature that refutes that same claim. Right. And so for every answer that you have, someone else is just going to throw this competing paper at you. But I think one of the issues that I'm particularly interested in, not because I think it's going to greatly impact people's health or change the world, is this kind of idea of dye chemistries that are in our foods. And the reason for that is because you have to start somewhere. You have to set an example. You have to start a precedent. Yeah. And if you can use kind of literature, which, believe it or not, people are like, oh, these dyes, these coloring agents, they're FDA approved. Well, again, FDA approved doesn't mean that they've been
FDA tested.
And there's a lot of literature actually that I've been aware of for many years in my studies that are talking about the mechanisms by which these things become toxic. Are the dyes themselves toxic? right? For example, if we're talking about these like red 40s or these azo dyes, the yellow 5s, tartrazine, are those themselves toxic? Maybe not. But the thing is, the body is complex, and oftentimes if we simplify it to, is that compound toxic? The answer might be no. But we all know that when we digest something, we have these reactions that occur. We have metabolism that occurs that breaks these things down.
Metabolites, it's how your body excretes it. It'll change the compound.
Exactly. And that's actually what's toxic, is they found that the anilins that come out of these azo dyes, because what happens is they become reduced at the azo bond, creates anilins. And anilins are extraordinarily toxic. They're carcinogenic, and they can cause a lot of issues. And so I'm not saying that these dyes themselves will do that, like that they're going to cause you to have cancer, but there's no doubt that there's at least a little bit of valid concern. The question is, could you consume enough of these dyes in your lifetime or in a number of years that the metabolic output would do damage opposed to other things? I don't know. Maybe you would have to eat grams of these dyes for that to be an issue. But to just say, no, let's not worry about it, I don't think that that's the right approach.
Right.
There has to be.
Okay.
Go for it.
Oh, no. I was just saying that the good example of an ingested chemical that's not toxic, that people might think is toxic, is alcohol, ethanol. That's not toxic. It's what the body metabolizes it into acetaldehyde that is toxic.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, like, the list can go on, right? I think there's kind of this pseudo-scientific understanding that people often apply to these situations to support their more or less personal opinions rather than let the science talk for itself.
Right.
And I think that that's what I find disturbing, is like, at very least, go after the real answers, try to investigate it, see what comes out. And if the answer is they're safe, great. But if I'd rather side on that or err on the side of caution than the alternative, or else you end up in a situation analogous to what Wiley was trying to fight.
Right, free for all, crazy crap being added.
Yeah. And I don't know. I find this whole topic really compelling just because there are so many still modern concerns in this area.
Right.
We've come a long ways. There's still a long ways to go.
Mm-hmm.
So
cool. I think we can wrap it up. Appreciate y'all listening.
Yeah.
Let us know if you think we should go into any other aspects of this in an upcoming pod, or any other topics that you might think is interesting that we can research into.
For sure. And I think maybe we'll, moving forward, like, have examples of kind of the current topics, and see if if something comes up that ties back into this, maybe we can reinvestigate some of it. So.
Right. Yeah. Alrighty. Appreciate you, fellas.
Yep. Thanks.